This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Nitsa, and it is Saturday, so that means it's time for another episode of the history of the banned and restricted list. Last time we looked at the year 2000, which was a relatively quiet year. There were a few cards that made it too easy to assemble combos that had managed to escape the bannings of 1999, as well as the issue of Rebels decks that broke Mask's block constructed. But after a really rough 1999, 2000 was a very smooth year. 2001 would go even more quietly. It would be the second year in a row where Standard didn't have to have any cards banned. However, there would be two announcements that year that made changes to the banned and restricted lists of Extended, Legacy, and Vintage. In all, though, only 3 cards were banned and restricted in 2001 that we haven't talked about as being banned and restricted in other formats. Let's start with the May announcement, which only affected Extended. The announcement added 4 cards to the ban list for this format. 2 of them, Necropotence and Demonic Consultation, had been banned and restricted in Legacy and Vintage in 2000 in an effort to weaken black decks, especially black combo decks, and that's why they ended up banned and extended as well. The other 2 cards in this announcement, Replenish and Survival of the Fittest, had never been banned or restricted in any other format. First, let's talk about Replenish. While it had been around since Urza's Destiny, it hadn't seen a ton of play. There were combos you could do with it, but none of them were overly concerning. However, that would all change late in 2000 when Replenish could enable some very silly combos thanks to the printing of Parallax Tide and Parallax Wave in Nemesis. If you could get both of those enchantments as well as Opalescence into play, you could pretty much exile all of your opponent's lands and creatures. With Replenish, getting them all in play was much easier, since you could discard them or mill them into your graveyard or put them there with Fact or Fiction, a card we'll talk about later. But the point is you could get them into your graveyard easily, then cast Replenish to get them all back. The combo worked like this. They are all creatures because of Opalescence when they come back. Then you exile 5 lands with Parallax Tide, in response to which you exile the Tide with your wave. Then the Tides leave the battlefield trigger happens, but it resolves before the other exile effects, so your opponent gets nothing back. Then you use the wave to exile 3 creatures and then itself, causing the same thing to happen. The leave the battlefield trigger happens before anything is actually exiled, so your opponent never gets their stuff back. Then you can beat your opponent to death with enchantments that have become creatures, and so on. This combo emerged in Standard in 2000, and while it wasn't completely busted there, it did inspire people to do even more powerful things with Replenish and Extended. You can combine only 2 enchantments for an instant win combo in Extended, Pandemonium and Sapperling Burst. Once you got them both in play, you just had to make a bunch of Sapperlings with Sapperling Burst, and it would be enough for lethal damage. While this deck never had a chance at the highest level because of this banning, it did prove far too consistent, and that's why it had to be banned in the first place. And in a more general sense, it seemed that Replenish was too good at enabling enchantment-based combos, so it was banned and extended in 2001. It would remain banned in that format for the entire time it existed, and it would be banned in Legacy a few years later in 2004, though it would be unbanned in 2007. Survival of the Fittest was also banned in the May 2001 announcement. Unlike Replenish, Survival of the Fittest had actually already seen a lot of play up to this point. We talked about it in passing when talking about the banning of Recurring Nightmare in Standard back in 1999, as the two could combine together to far too easily reanimate big scary creatures. Survival of the Fittest continued to find success without Recurring Nightmare, and it could enable creature-based combo decks. Ever since the debacle of Combo Winter, Wizards did whatever they could to crack down on combo decks that were too consistent, and Survival of the Fittest seemed to fall into that category. It also became quite powerful in conjunction with Squee, Goblin Nabob, who made the fact you had to discard a card not really matter, and since the deck could just search up Squee when it wanted, it wasn't like this was something difficult to pull off. Additionally, Survival of the Fittest could not only enable combos, but powerful toolbox decks that could run situational singleton copies of things that could be searched up at will, and overall that made the deck far too consistent. This is another card that made decks resemble Birthing Pod decks of Magic's more recent history, and Birthing Pod, of course, also has a history of being on the banned and restricted list. The flexibility and power of Survival of the Fittest got it banned and extended in 2001, and it would be banned in Legacy several years later in 2010, and it was never unbanned in either format. The other announcement for 2001 came in December, and it only included a single card, Fact or Fiction, which was banned in Legacy and restricted in Vintage. Fact or Fiction is a really interesting card in terms of design, as it makes both players make really interesting decisions. The card is really powerful because it lets you pay 4 mana at instant speed to draw cards and get some card selection, but what really pushed it over the edge is the fact that if you played it in a deck that also had no problem pulling stuff out of the graveyard, there was no real downside. This had helped enable the Replenish decks to the point that Replenish, of course, had to be banned, and it was even more of a problem in Legacy and Vintage decks, where there were even more ways to take advantage of the graveyard. Basically, the problem was that the decision was no longer an interesting one for either player, because there were plenty of times where the player who cast it was perfectly happy putting one of the piles in the graveyard, and that just wasn't how this card was intended to work. Overall, it made blue decks too good, and they even considered banning it in Standard, but in the end it did escape that fate. The card was so powerful that an acronym emerged to describe what it was like to play against or with this card. That acronym is EOTFOFYL, which stood for End of Turn, Fact or Fiction, You Lose. The card was far too swingy in formats like Legacy and Vintage, and it had to get axed because the format was completely warping around it. And it could make graveyard-based combo decks and blue decks, more generally, far too consistent. It would remain banned in Legacy until 2004 and restricted in Vintage until 2011. So that's it for 2001, which was a very quiet year. The fewest cards were banned or restricted since the inception of the banned and restricted list back in 1994. However, believe it or not, 2002 was even quieter, without any changes to any format's lists occurring. 2002 would be the only year in the history of the game where this is true. So yeah, we won't be doing a video on 2002 next time, we'll be skipping straight to 2003. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future episodes of this series, don't forget to subscribe, and if you want to catch up on the series, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.